Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us for History Act's Black History Matters. I'm Stephen Blaney. I'm one of the History Acts Collective, and I'm chairing tonight from Sheffield. For the people who haven't joined us before, the aim of History Acts is to connect activists and historians with a focus on how we can make history useful for organising in the present. We used to do these in person before the pandemic started, but we've been moving online, looking at how people are organising during the crisis. And I think tonight's topic is especially urgent for us all as activists and historians, and it's great to have so many people registered. In terms of how this is all going to work, in a minute I'll introduce our panel, and they'll each speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we can open it up to discussion. You should all be muted now, but when we get to the discussion stage, you'll have the option to unmute, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. If you do want to contribute or ask a question, I'd ask that you use the chat to write a private message to me, Stephen Blaney. There's a drop-down menu where you can find me, and just put your name, and so I'll have a list of names and call people to speak in that order. If we try and minimize sort of general discussion in the chat box, so we don't distract from the discussion on here. If you're following this on the YouTube live stream, you can also type your questions in the chat box and we can read them out. As we are recording the stream as well, and the video will go out later along with a write-up of the event. Finally, just before we start, to say that Holly from History Acts will be live tweeting, and if you do want to get involved on Twitter, please do, using the hashtag HistoryActs. So with apologies for all that information, I'm really excited to introduce our panelists tonight. So first, live from Oxford, we're going to have Jabu-Nala Hartley, who's a co-founder of Oxford Anti-Racist City, a project which focuses on disrupting and challenging institutional racism. And she's been part of the Black Lives Matter protests in Oxford, including this evening where she's speaking from tonight. Then we'll hear from Florence Adeoye, who's a recent graduate from the University of Liverpool in politics, policy and history, and a member of the Young Historians Project, which is a group of young people excavating African and Caribbean people's history in the UK. On the historian side of our panel, we've got Christienna Fryar, who's a lecturer in Black British history at Goldsmiths, and Dr. Ashley Howard, who's assistant professor at the University of Iowa. So without further ado, Jabu, if you want to take it away.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, good evening, everybody. I'm here parked in some corner in the street of Oxford. I'm part of a march for Black Lives Matter, and I'm meant to speak in like another half an hour. So because I had sort of committed to this, I wanted to just come in and say something. Today is very significant for me because historically, as you know, June 16 in South Africa was a student uprising which was part of the decolonizing the curriculum. The students were protesting against the 1953 Bantu Education Act, which was basically to teach Black students to teach Black students inferior education, which was relegated to Black people. So today I felt it was really important to join this march when I was asked. But another issue also is that as we are marching around here in Oxford, we are actually also calling for the decolonization of the curriculum by removing the statutes. As we pass the Cecil Rhodes statue, it's got security, it's being secured. People are calling for the removal of the statue because of its historical context. As most of you know, Cecil Rhodes was an imperialist who at some stage was a prime minister of the Cape Colony in South Africa. And his views are well documented about how he felt about Black people. He basically saw them as subhuman. So what we're saying is these statues, whilst a lot of people may argue that, no, that's just history, they're no longer effective, they are a symbol of oppression to Black people. So we are calling for the removal of these statues. So my role here as a part of the Oxford Anti-Racist City is to disrupt structural racism in terms of what our communities have been through. as much as a lot of people don't understand the significance of symbolism, if you were once a victim of a crime, anything that resembles that will always have that effect on reminding you of that pain. And this is what Black people are saying, that these statutes, they serve nothing but a reminder of our pain. And for people that justify why they should be up there, it's nothing but to glorify an imperialist past, which we have fought, and we thought people were now coming together in peace and unity, and addressing the what you call the structural racism of the past. But seemingly it seems to be kind of following to the point that even today as we speak, about 50% of the British population still believe that colonialism was justified. So these are the issues that we face and we have to tackle as a Black community. So as I said, I will say something. I'm gonna have to get back to the march. I'm really sorry, but I wanted to participate and have this constructive debate. And we are happy that a lot of our white communities are now coming in and wanting to be educated about these issues. Please, let's educate ourselves, because this ignorance is what is causing the current situation where you're seeing COVID-19 has more BAME deaths and more BAME people, even though I'm qualified, I've got a master's degree, but most of the jobs that I'm relegated to is support work or cleaning jobs, and people don't want to give me opportunities that I'm qualified to do. And that is the reality of Black people in the UK, and it is a historical legacy. People do not see us as people that should have, I'm not saying Black people do not have professions, yes they do, but there is so much racism within the social stratification of those roles. So my role as a part of disrupting structural racism is to see an end to this oppression for people that have always resisted peacefully. They've always resisted peacefully. You saw the example of the weekend march, which was in London, where the fascist organizations came and were basically bringing violence into a space which was peaceful. And one of the most courageous acts that's been paraded around the media was a Black man fishing out one of the racist thugs that was left in that crowd, who would have been absolutely massacred in terms of the youth. But the interesting thing is they were trying to claim this this hero as a sort of a kind of like a token of what people should be behaving. The man clearly said, we were there to make sure that we are protecting our children, because if we did not intervene, those children would now be in prison, and nobody would care that this man had gone there to cause this trouble. So there's a divide here. There's a divide. We're walking, we're marching in Oxford. There's a divide. There's a tale of two cities. There's a town and gown. We are coming from a perspective where we live in the areas which are poor areas. As rich as Oxford is, as much as it has appropriated in terms of the enslavement of Black people, they have not considered the generations of these people that they exploited, and we are still suffering from this 400 years of this colonialist past, of the enslavement of our people. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Jabu. It's great that you're coming live from the March in Oxford, and it's really great to have you here. We'll move on to Florence now.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm Florence, and I'm from the Young Historians Project, and we are a group that I think came around 2015 after the History Matters conference, to like address the very low numbers of history students and teachers who were of African and Caribbean heritage, because there are like, you can count them on your hands, how many people there are. I joined in April 2019, so it's just been just over a year, and so I joined through Twitter. I just saw the picture and was like, oh, this is interesting. So maybe I can talk to other people about history without boring my friends. And I came after the first project, which was about the Black Liberation Front. There was an entire project. There was an exhibition, which was would be explained and used like original interviews from people who are part of the Black Liberation Front. And currently, we're doing a project on African women and the British Health Service from 1930 to 2000. So if you go on the website, you can see all of that. We do original interviews, go into women who have worked in health service in different capacities, and we do lots of archival research, sifting through stuff, trying to like tease out what is going to be relevant. Thank you. What's going to be relevant for us to be able to like explain our history to people. So through that we do. So I'm personally part of the schools project, schools team, and we do workshops, and so that we basically get information, what we've learned, and we're changing it. Currently we're changing it to be more of an online platform, considering everything's happening, so that students are able to see our work, understand it, and like see themselves in history, which is obviously, it's not everyone thinks this, but it's an important part of the truth-telling process, because a lot of the time in schools especially, if you do get some kind of Black history, it's not extensive, it's not informative, and makes you feel like history is only history in only certain aspects. I think we most had got in school with like learning about Olade Equiano for like 2 weeks, and that was it. Until I went to uni, and I was given the opportunity to do more. But obviously we wanted to tackle that at a younger age. And so the idea, I guess, of the project is to teach history, and that's on which is each one teach one, as we learn it, and essentially to create more Black historians, to create more people who are dedicated to learning about our history and being able to go through that truth-telling process, so that kids are able to see themselves and other people in general able to see themselves, which is something we make sure that we're in the we are the ones doing the workshop, so it's not just necessarily just through booklets, but you can see us, you can see people who look like you, and lots of different kinds of people who look like you, depending on what you look like, or like what your hair is like, which is like small things that I think are actually really important in terms of representation, especially for young people, and especially in history. Yeah, I think that's mostly.
Great, thanks, Florence. No, really great to hear all that. So we'll move on now to Christienna, who I think potentially taught Florence at Liverpool before she moved to Goldsmiths.
I did. So it's of course good to see Florence. Hi, Florence. The instructions that we got from Stefan were that the historian should respond to the activists. So I'm going to talk pretty quickly because I don't have a lot of sort of formal notes or formal things to get through. But one of the things that I've been thinking about over the past few weeks is why the discussion, why the Black Lives Matter discussion has focused so much on statutes. And part of that is, of course, that I guess it was about a week and a half ago now, the Edward Colston statue was pulled down, and then delightfully, to my mind, dumped into the harbor or river. And so, of course, there's a particular reason why we're talking about statues in that context. And then that, of course, turned attention back towards the Rhodes statue at Oxford, which Jabu has just talked to us about. And that's, again, like the Colston statue, that is an ongoing campaign that people have wanted these statues down. I really liked what Jabu said about statues being, these particular statues being symbols of oppression of Black people. So there's been a lot of discussion about removing these that has been long going and that has come back at this particular moment. But I think there's something else that's happening, particularly when you look not so much at what activists are calling for, but the response to what activists are calling for, in the media, from politicians, et cetera. And there, I think there's something incredibly pernicious that's going on in that discussion. And it ties to what Florence just drew our attention to, which is how little of Britain's history is well known, and how little of it certainly is circulating in schools, but also because it's not circulating in schools, is also so many myths are circulating in the public discourse. And there's one in particular that was circulating over the past week, which is the idea that Britain was the first country to abolish slavery. And I believe Diana Payton is in the Zoom, so I do want to shout out the piece that she wrote for History Workshop Online about this issue. But there's this narrative there was a tweet that was then being circulated quite a lot, that Britain was the first country to abolish slavery. And this is just incredibly not true. It's not close to true. It is. Britain wasn't the first country to abolish the slave trade, which it did in 1807. But Britain didn't abolish slavery itself until 1834, and then actually historians tend to refer to the actual end of slavery as happening in the British Caribbean in 1838. So that's a 30-year gap between when we are apparently being told on Twitter that Britain abolished slavery, because the argument for this person was 1807. That's a 30-year gap. That is 30 years in which certainly my ancestors, at least the enslaved ancestors I had in the Caribbean, my enslaved ancestors were still enslaved while this person assumes that they weren't. That is 30 years in which people died enslaved, who under terrible circumstances. Part of what I think is happening here is of course sort of a constant attempt to present and position Britain as this moral nation, but I think it is also another way in which we see that in the British public sphere, Black lives don't matter. It is apparently it's fine to conflate these 30 years. It's just a blip. It's just a short period of time. But it was not a short period of time for those people who remained enslaved between 1807 and 1834, who then became apprentices in most of the British Caribbean between 1834 and 1838. So even that slippage to me is really telling. It's not just that it's a misunderstanding of history. It is also suggesting that ultimately, as long as Britain eventually abolished slavery, that it doesn't really matter the people who lived and died in those 30 years. The sort of last set of things the last points that I want to make before I hand over is that this is another one of those moments, and I think we see this here in Britain, we certainly see this back where I'm from in the United States, that this is a moment where nations are really struggling to deal with the national myths that sort of uphold them. And so I've said before that all nations lie to themselves, which I think is true. And if we look at the types of lies that the US tells about slavery and the types of lies that Britain tells about slavery, they're different lies. So the US lie is that slavery isn't that bad. And this lie, I think, is useful for the US because unlike Britain, the US can't act as though slavery didn't exist. The landscape shows that slavery existed. People are still getting married on plantations. So this is not a place where we can ignore the existence of slavery. But instead, the narrative is that slavery wasn't that bad, that there were these, kindly slave owners who were benevolent towards enslaved people. And that lie is very useful in the US because it doesn't require that we think carefully about the founding of the nation. So we don't, if we assume that it wasn't that bad, then we assume that that Thomas Jefferson wasn't that bad, or we assume that George Washington isn't that bad, or as the discussion has been happening over the past few weeks, people are suddenly learning that Robert E. Lee was not a kindly slave owner. And I have to admit, as a Virginian, I was raised with the narrative that Robert E. Lee was a kindly slave owner, and I believed that for a very long time, not because I was a fan of Robert E. Lee per se, but that is the narrative that you learn if you are in a Virginia public school at any point, probably in the last 40, 50 years and onward. So the lie, I think, in Britain is much trickier, and I think the lie is that Britain was not necessarily a slave holding nation, but that it was only a slave trading nation. And I think we're seeing that here in this week's debates, or in the debates of the past 10 days. That Colston, yes, it is unfortunate that he was a slave trader, is how some of this narrative tends to go. But ultimately, he was a good philanthropist. He was an important citizen for Bristol. He has civic importance. And one can think that way if you're not properly thinking about what it meant to trade in enslaved Africans. And I think the narratives that we are working with in this country are very much not grappling with what it means, what it meant that so much of this country's wealth at a point in time was dependent on the trade and the abuse and basically killing of millions of enslaved Africans. And the same holds true in terms of both what Jabu mentioned and Florence mentioned. The same holds true for the way that Britain is grappling with the legacies of imperialism. It's very common. We see a lot of this language around the British Empire bestowed things upon the rest of the world. That the rest of the world should be thankful for the rule of law, for sports, for the English language, on and on and on. And of course, that narrative can't exist without, or that narrative can't exist at the same time as we're focused intently on the massacres, the famines, the extraction of wealth, the violent extraction of wealth. And then particularly in the age of decolonization in the 1950s and 1960s, the subsequent burning of the proof of all of these crimes. So this idea of national myths is something that I'm thinking about, or that I have been thinking about over the past 10 days. And what I'll end with is that I hope that as we're talking about statues and as we're having this national conversation, that doesn't come to stand in for the really serious conversation that Black people are trying to have in this country about, yes, forms of police brutality in Britain, about, for example, these COVID reports about the BAME community, which have been, if I understand it correctly, some of them have been held back for a few days, trying to sort of ride out a news cycle. There was, I believe it was a few days ago, that there were recommendations that were actually being made that had been left out of those reports. And then again, so basically Black people and people of color in this country are having to wait for what could be vital life-saving information in the middle of a global pandemic. And so I think, and it's probably a little ironic to say that this as a historian, the historical conversation I think is really important, but I don't want it to overshadow or be a way of overshadowing the real grievances that people are making in these protests and in these marches, and real grievances about British matters and not simply solidarity with US activists.
Thanks so much, Christienna. I'm going to post that article by Diana Payton that you mentioned in the chat so people can have a look at that in their own time. But finally, Ashley Howard.
Hello, everybody. It's so lovely to be here. I have very similar kind of thoughts here to Christienna, but I'll take it kind of back then forward. So obviously the legacy of colonialism and racism looms large in all of this. But what I find to be particularly inspiring is in moments like this, international solidarity around pushing back against anti-Black oppression really comes to the fore. And there's been this long history of that. If we think about some of the earliest Pan-African conferences, if we think about the counter-conference to the Treaty of Versailles, if we think about the Garvey movement, if we think about Bandung, if we think about Pan-Africanism, in the 60s and 70s, people of color, Black and Indigenous folk around the globe have often found that they have more in common with each other than the people who are oppressing them want to think. But oftentimes what happens is in these moments of global solidarity, there is a concentrated effort to deny their humanity, to deny their history, and to deny their organizing power. So I think, again, as Florence said, the importance of history is so absolutely crucial in thinking about how we remember and how we frame these events. And I don't know if there's any Michael Jackson fans in the crowd, perhaps. I mean, he has some good stuff, right? And so I think about his song, Remember the Time. This is when he's dressed up like in ancient Egypt. Aman is there. It's a whole look. And one of the lyrics is, I forgot to remember. Part of what we're witnessing here is, again, this moment where the powers that be, right, the American state, the British state, colonialism, etc., forget to remember their history, forget to remember the actual primal violence that occurred that leads to kind of this violence in quotations that we see now, right? And I'm remiss to think about this as violence, that tearing down a statue of an old racist or breaking windows can be understood as violence that causes people to go out and be upset. But kneeling on a man's neck for 9 minutes, right, is not seen as that kind of violence. Having a disproportionate amount of people die of COVID because of race-based disparities in healthcare is not a violence. So that's one of the myths that I kind of want to shake and disabuse ourselves of, is that the first violence is property violence. The actual first violence that we're witnessing right now is manifold. It's institutional, it's interpersonal, it's structural, it's cultural, right? All of these things that Africans, people of African descent, and other people of color in this world have been pushing back against is ever present. And these moments of unrest, these moments of protest are but a blip of resistance in what is a constant stream. So that's the first kind of myth I want to break, is this idea that violence is ever present in these communities. The second myth that I want to break apart is this idea that there is a right way to protest. This is an idea that's gaining a lot of traction in the United States. Why can't they protest more like Martin Luther King Jr.? Or why don't they just vote? You know, somebody told me that on the street the other day. Which, you know, if you have been following American politics, what has happened last week in Georgia is one of the reasons why the vote isn't the end-all be-all, right? We still see the structural violence through gerrymandering, from inefficient polling places, from mandatory ID checks, all these issues that are constantly being put in the way of people who are trying to exercise their rights as citizens. And this kind of violent protest that we've been seeing in America, right, over the course, I believe, of 700 different cities have had some sort of demonstration, indicates that this is a nationwide problem and that people are fed up. And they are engaging in this type of protest because they feel that all the other so-called sanctioned or approved ways of protesting have been denied them and have been ignored by them. And so that's this thing that the second myth I want to bust here, is this idea that the protest that we have been witnessing is aberrant, right? That it's out of nowhere and that it's counterproductive. If we know from the 1960s, these types of violent property violence protests actually brought about immediate changes. Now, of course, we also see the property of diminishing returns here. With every subsequent uprising that happens, the state gets better and better at shutting it down and funds more money into policing and less money into the services that the people were demanding to begin with. And what I want to close with, kind of tying both of these things together, are ignoring of history and the efficacy of different types of protests, is that we need to look to the 1960s as a way to understand social movement theory. Now, I've been saying this often. What we are witnessing right now in 2020 is a whole different era in protests. It's not fair to compare it to 1967. It's not fair to compare it to 1968, or even the uprisings that occurred in London or Paris or Baltimore or Ferguson at the beginning of this millennium, right, at the beginning of the 21st century. What we are witnessing in 2020 is something wholly new. But what we can do is to begin to apply some of these social movement theories and what has happened before to help inform our protests moving forward. The first is the idea of tactical adaptation, right? We see people strategically moving in different places than we saw in the 1960s. Namely, in the American context, whereas the 1960s uprisings took place in Black communities, now they are moving to downtown and commercial areas. The second is resource mobilization, and we really see this through the use of social media, right? Organizing people, getting them together, getting the supplies you need. And if we look to Seattle, right, they are mobilizing communities, they're having teach-ins, they have first aid stations, they have food stations. In Minneapolis, the items that were taken from the Target were then put on display for people to take what they needed, right? That's a mobilizing of resources. The third is framing. So the idea of framing is how you see this. And so what we're witnessing right now in 2020 is the 5 years of groundwork that Black Lives Matter has put in, right? That hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag Justice For, hashtag Say Her Name, hashtag If They Gun Me Down. All of these are circulating in social media and have radically shifted the way we understand police and anti-Black violence in this country and globally, right? That people weren't resisting arrest or other things, blaming the victim. It is taking Black voice, Black experience, Black authenticity at face value. And the final is political opportunity and strategic alliances. Again, this is where I see a lot of really exciting, hopeful things happening, as whereas in the 1960s, these were predominantly Black events. In 2020, these are multiracial, right? So we're forming new political alliances. And one thing that we can see is different people based on their identities can mobilize in different communities. So when we have white allies out there, white allies tweeting and sharing these things, this reaches a whole nother community that, say, my voice would not be as relevant or respected as. And also political opportunity, right? We cannot overlook the fact that these events are happening in the midst of a global pandemic, and one where austerity measures had already been creeping in and now are talking about. So what better opportunity, right, if we're thinking again of political opportunities, to defund the police, right? When people are concerned about the budgets and the bottom line, there is a line item that has a ton of money being poured into that can either be chopped or allocated to other resources. And so that's kind of lessons that we can take from social movement theory and lay them on to the 1960s and the 2020 I don't know, exciting protests, revolts, demonstrations, revolution that we see happening now. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Ashley. So everyone was really brief, which is great, which means we have loads of time for discussion. We're at complete capacity on a Zoom account. We are live streaming on YouTube as well, and I think people should be following us there as well. So the way this will work is I've already got a couple of people actually who've put their name down, but if you want to speak on Zoom, find the chat box and drop down to my name, Stefan, and just message me your name, and then I'll call people in the order that I get names. If you're on the YouTube stream, you can put your question in there, and someone will be passing those on to me, I think. I'm not sure if Jabu is still here and listening to us, so I don't know if she can contribute, but it was great to see the live stream of her joining the march after she finished speaking as well. So first up to speak, I'll take Joanna and then Guy, and then all the panelists can feel free to just jump in. So Joanna de Groot. Sorry, you're muted, Joanna.
Am I still muted?
No, there you go. Go ahead.
Okay, so I think I want to begin by thanking the speakers, because I absolutely don't want to stand on my privilege, which I know exists. I want to stand on my respect and enthusiasm for what they're saying and doing, but also to feed in to a conversation as a historian. So first of all, I thought something that we could all have a conversation about is this interesting relationship between recovering the past, if you like, really talking, as Christienna did, that Black Lives Matter, and simply talking about the lives and how they were lived both now and in the past, and what connections there are, but how that leads to something actually as important, which is actually retelling the stories, the narratives, so that actually how we understand British or American, or indeed French or Dutch history, if we wanted to go there, or Iberian histories, changes if we bring in the Black lives. It isn't just that we have a whole load of information, it actually is that our thought ways needs to change. And that's what's so powerful to me about the relationship between the politics of Black Lives Matter, if you like, and the historical dynamic. And ultimately, I think it takes us even further than that, but it takes us to a place where we actually rethink some of the big ideas. I mean, I think about neoliberalism differently once you see it as racialized, for example, in the same way as I would have thought of early capitalism differently, because it draws in the embodied labor of enslaved people in different and other colonial and imperial stuff. So I think that's a very rich thing for historians, and it's quite a political thing as well. And I just wanted to end with a little thought about statues, because actually the pulling down of statues, about which you can have all sorts of debates, and I'm not going to get into that, has been a feature of all kinds of insurgent movements. I mean, in the French Revolution, for example, in the Reformation, where people who want to, as it were, push against whatever it is they're pushing against, if you like, the power of pulling down statues, which is about challenging memory, challenging narrative, is something that's kind of, as it were, there's a very specific, obviously, Black Lives Matter take on that, but I think in a way there are people who would understand what they're doing from completely different historical experiences, which is, to me, is quite exciting. And that there's some link between the sort of symbolic and political power of going after statues, problematic as some people might think that is, and the other much more material things which Florence and Ashley and Christienna and Jabu were talking about. And I think that's an interesting and difficult conversation, actually, about focusing on the statues as opposed to, let's say, social injustices or economic deprivations or whatever. But anyway, those are just things that sort of, and it's because of our speakers that I'm able to say what I'm saying. So I'm doing it in respect.
Great, thank you, Joanna. Yeah, I'll take Guy's contribution, and then anyone from the panel who wants to jump in on either of those. So Guy Bowman. Guy, there, are you need to unmute, or? There you go. Go ahead.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, everyone. I just wanted. I mean, my question is really, well, it's for everyone, but it was prompted by what Christienna said, which is why is the focus on statues, and really my question that springs from that is, so what might be other focuses? What are other focuses that would be useful within a UK context? Christienna gave a couple of examples, but I'm interested in hearing from everyone else as well, where the energy or the priority should be for the UK.
Great, thanks. Yeah, does anyone from the panel want to jump in on those points before we go to more questions?
I can say something a little bit quickly, because I want to make sure that I wasn't misunderstood. From my perspective, if activists and protesters want to take down statues, I have no problem with that. And that's, for me, that's not an issue of, for me, my question about focus is not what activists are doing with statues, but more why the conversation, the public conversation, has focused so much on whether those statues should go, or whether other statues should go, as opposed to the other really substantive concerns and questions that activists have been raising. So I just want to make sure before things go too far, that people weren't mistaking my comments as suggesting that activists shouldn't focus on statues. But I do think actually part of what Joanna just raised about the idea that thinking about the history, particularly the lived experience of Black people in the past, has real implications for national narratives, I think is entirely true. And she raised neoliberalism and early capitalism. I would add to that liberalism itself, and the sort of idea that Britain was this liberal humanitarian nation. Part of what I do in my own work is really question that based on what we actually see the British state doing in post-emancipation Jamaica. So freed people were supposed to be this class of people that that Britain was protecting, and what did that quote unquote protection actually look like? And well, I won't get into all of my book's research. It was not protection, and it was very much steeped in forms of racism, as well as ideas about liberalism still creating sort of these embedded hierarchies. So for me, that is the work. The work is to question these narratives and these, to my mind, national myths by including a much broader body politic that in Britain includes the free people of the Caribbean. I'm sure for people who are historians of the United States, that would include, again, a much wider cast of characters than the sort of traditional, airport bookshelf histories tend to include.
Great, thanks. If no one else is keen to jump in, oh wow, we've got thunder and lightning here now. If no one else wants to come in from the panel now, I'll take next couple of questions. I'll take one. Did you hear the thunder? I'll take one from Danny Riley, but first I'll read out a question from Yamisha from YouTube, which is, will the movement peter out after COVID as we have less time to focus on these issues? So that's a question from Yamisha, and I'll take Danny's question as well quickly.
Thank you very much indeed. We've got a small group down in Plymouth in the southwest called Mayflower Mavericks, because it's the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower, and they've got big Mayflower commemorations centered in Plymouth. Now, we've been campaigning for about 5 years down here, and we're not very successful. We've produced books, we've produced websites, etc. But we're conscious that you need surprising forms. That the thing that happened in Bristol had a knock-on effect in Plymouth overnight. We've been going on about the naming of Hawkins Square in Plymouth for years. In 2 days of that statue coming down, they'd agreed to change that name. That's the effect. If we go back to earlier things that someone was mentioning about the slave trade abolition in 1807, when the 200th anniversary of that occurred, they tried to turn it into a Wilberforce fest. And the person who stopped it was a guy called Toyin Abagutu, who went to Westminster Abbey and walked across when they were doing that, and he got the issue of slavery rather than Wilberforce put on the agenda by his action protesting actually in the Westminster Abbey with the Queen present. We need surprising and militant protest, and I'd like the speakers, who I found very good actually, to maybe comment about that. Thank you. I'm not a very good speaker, sorry.
Great, thanks, Danny. Does anyone want to come in on either of those? Florence, Ashley, Christienna?
I want to say something. I think I want to keep talking about statues, but we were before, when I don't know what was before. I think going on what Christienna said about statues, yeah, I don't think that it's not necessarily that they shouldn't come down, but I think it's okay for activist movements to have more than one goal and like want to do more than one thing. So in terms of like practically like Roosevelt's Fall, yes, like if it makes people, especially students who are attending these universities, feel more comfortable to not see someone who was trying to murder and was murdering their ancestors being taken down, then I think that's okay. But also to, I think, as you were saying, that idea of like having a kind of like transformative education and making sure to like constantly question stuff. And I especially think it's important to try and make this accessible, which is again what we do in the Young Historians Project, with the idea of like, in order for history, because I think we have a lot of the time we have it gatekeeped, and it's only certain people, like if you go to university, then you have access to JSTOR and you have access to SagePub and all these things, and then you can know what books to have. And I think the thing about social media is that all of these resources being shared widely, but also people are changing them. So I've seen people, especially on Twitter, have books, like, and then like who have read the books and changed them into threads. So changing threads that people can like, people like, it's just essentially easier to understand. So that, because I feel like sometimes, especially when it comes to texts that are about like radical changes, it's not always easy to understand straight away, because it takes you actually unlearning everything that you already know, in terms of like the way that the world is set up and the structures you have. So I think education obviously is a big part of that, but the way we teach and the way we spread information is effective in this kind of time. The way we teach needs to be effective, but it also needs to be so that more than one kind of person can understand it. But also to address, I just wanted to address the issue about well, this people after the Black Lives Matter, after like all of this has died down. And I think this is a fear that I've also had, and I think quite a few people have had, in terms of like, maybe it's because we're in a pandemic and everyone's at home, so suddenly everyone has time to suddenly start asking, where can we get this from? Where can we buy this book? I think that at least for some people, especially for people like me who have been working and have been doing the activist work, doing the research, we can see like that our work isn't in vain, because like Danny's just said, in terms of it took 2 days for that to suddenly happen. It's like, oh, well, can these things suddenly happen? I didn't realize that it was actually possible, anything that I wanted, rather than thinking that it's like a faraway dream. So I think that it could change, and it will develop in terms of, I think, more people being held to account, in terms of, especially in terms of workplace and institutions. I think people might be bolder and might feel like more confident to tell people, oh, actually, like, I don't like the fact that there's not enough, we haven't been learning about this enough in schools, and there'll be more pressure. I think it's a consistent work, and it's organizations that are doing consistent work that needs to be bolstered in order for this to not just die out and die away. Also, sorry if you couldn't hear me.
No, that's great, Florence. Yeah, Ashley or Christienna, did you want to come in on that before I go back to?
I mean, I think Florence really hit the head on the point, the nail on the head. Got at the point that, you know, these are genuine grievances that have pushed people out into the street, not boredom. And I think that's evident in the radicalness and the militancy in which people are engaging with these things. What last year was seen as just, you know, unreasonable and a fantasy is now common sense. You know, it has been mainstreamed, right? To think that defunding the police is something that many American cities are taking very seriously, I find very promising. And at least in the case of the United States, and I suspect from the images that I've seen abroad, this is largely being driven by young people. Young people who may be in college or working part-time, but are certainly unsure about their future and anxious about it and want to make the world a better place. And so to think about what does this militancy look like, and how do we keep moving this energy and make it more than just about statues and demonstrating, is to really think about those core places where people do not feel like they're part of society, right? We know that there are very few women of color who are in the academy in Britain. We know that there are many universities who are adjacent to Black neighborhoods that do not have a proportional amount of those students in their universities. We know that there are certain jobs that Black folks do not have. And so what does it mean to, like you said, Mr. Riley, to stand up in front of Parliament and agitate for that? What does it mean? Where are the places in your own life that you can recognize those racial disparities and begin to start speaking up? I think for us moving forward, that's the challenge that we all need to address.
Great, thanks. I've got a growing list of people wanting to speak, so I'll take Sarah May and then Elena Gino. Sarah. Are you there, Sarah? I don't think we've got Sarah, so I'll take Elena.
Hi, first of all, I wanted to say thank you. That was really fascinating. I thought it was so interesting and well done. I had sort of two things that I kind of wanted to talk about. One was what do you kind of think of these white savior narratives, and how far do you think that sort of historians have in the past kind of maybe inadvertently pushed those kind of narratives? And I also suppose I wanted to talk about this idea that how do we detach our past from our present, and how do we sort of, like with the Holocaust in Germany and things like that, how do we kind of have this pride in our British identity, but at the same time this kind of scrutiny of our past actions and how we can be better in the present?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, does anyone want to come in on those?
I will take the latter question, in that I think part of being proud of your nation, and we can have a critique about nationalism and how it gets us into these trouble sometimes, but is acknowledging what has been done and being very mindful about how to right those. There's an American historian, African-American historian by the name of Vincent Harding. And he says that the narratives that Americans have told themselves about Black history can be codified as white, Negro, and Black history. White is this triumphalist narrative that, we came and we saw and we conquered. Negro history is inserting Black people into that narrative, right? Not challenging the whole of it. And then we have Black history, which is looking critically from all angles what the impact of certain historical actions are, and really being mindful. Again, in the United States, we can also look to South Africa, we can also look to Rwanda, these kind of truth and reconciliation commissions that they've had about what has actually happened around these issues, what was the harm done, sometimes by both sides, and where do we go moving forward. And I think that is one way to really own our own history and think about how to use that history to inform how we'll shape our future as well.
Yeah, I would really agree with what Ashley has just said. I think in the U.S. context, one of the things that's been that people say a lot about the sort of continued bubbling up of this Confederate stuff, which there's been a thing on Twitter recently about how short the Confederate States of America actually existed. So it's 4 years. And so people were like, how many things have you had? How many shirts have you had that lasted longer than the Confederacy? But part of what's going on there is that there never has been a truth and reconciliation process or any kind of airing and full unearthing of those histories. And I think the same is very much true for Britain as well. And if I can take the Elena's first question about white savior narratives, I think why these are so popular, and the one that I focus on in my research the most are these ideas about abolition and abolitionists. And I believe it was Danny Riley who mentioned, or maybe it was somebody else, who mentioned that 1807 became just about William Wilberforce and these other white abolitionists. But I think part of why those are so popular here in Britain is not just that they are some of the founding myths. I mean, not quite founding myths, but they're some of the sort of key national myths. I think it's also that Britain really struggles to understand Black people as part of the national fabric and part of the body politic in a way that I think we don't see it. It's not as easy to do in the US, although people certainly by all means try. But because Black Britons were, for the most part, in the Caribbean, and then by the late 19th century were in various African colonies, that the narrative is that Blackness is foreignness here, and it still we still see it. This is in part what the Windrush scandal is all about. The idea that Black people who came here as citizens, who they weren't just subjects, but they came here as citizens, that their citizenship could be stripped from them, and that their evidence of lawful arrival could be destroyed by the Home Office. And then in the 2010s, they just start telling these people that they have no right to be here. Part of that is because there is an assumption that Black people don't have the right to be here. And so when Black people are not seen as part of the national fabric, then there's nobody to turn to for a savior narrative who isn't white. And so it can't really be Olaudah Equiano. It couldn't be Jack Gladstone, who was the leader of the Demerara Rebellion in 1823, or Sam Sharpe, who was the leader of the Baptist War, or the Sam Sharpe Rebellion, which is also known as the Baptist War, or the Christmas Rebellion in 1831. And that rebellion in Jamaica was critical in moving Parliament towards abolishing abolishing slavery. It was because of that rebellion that they realized that they were going to have to end slavery very quickly, or else enslaved people were going to do that for them. You can't have a narrative that sees Paul Bogle as an important British figure, who was the leader of the Morant Bay Rebellion in 1865, yet another rebellion that was trying to push for the proper treatment of a Black peasantry in Jamaica. So with all these people seen as foreign, despite being British subjects and having the same legal status as people in Britain, there was no citizenship, no legal citizenship at the time. But these people aren't seen as British because they're from somewhere else and they're foreign. And I think we see that in this particular moment. There's a lot of discussion in the last few weeks about how ex-Black commentator, I think it was Afua Hirsch, but this frequently comes up. Any Black commentator who makes a critical comment about Britain is told to go back home, whether they were born here or not. This is a constant narrative that is turned to, and I think that is part of what makes these white savior narratives so easy to access, because those are the only people who are figured as being part of the nation.
Right, thanks. So I've got Gloria Lilly and then Derek Armour. Gloria, you said your mic might not be working, so do you want to try it out? I think you're on mute. There you go.
Hi. Hi guys, sorry. So I just okay, so I'm joining as a parent, and obviously the issues of the past few weeks have almost mobilized me to reflect, respond, and work out ways to react. So one of the things I've been consuming at the moment is the work of Akala. Now, I actually had his book, but I didn't read it, but suddenly he speaks to me because he kind of comes from London and a part that where I grew up. But my point was, he picked up something about Pan-Africanism, and he said that when he was growing up, he went to a supplementary Pan-African school, and he felt that somewhat inoculated him and protected him from the way Black people were seen in the media. He kind of had an other perspective. And as we're trying to talk about dealing with the structural racism and the structural inequalities at the moment, I'm thinking kind of instead of top down but bottom up. How do the panel feel about this idea of supplementary schools being a form of activism, a form of, I guess, immobilizing young Black youths perhaps in understanding history as you speak as historians? Just how do you feel about that? I'm a parent, I'm struggling to, I grew up in Lagos up to the age of 8. So for me, understanding British history wasn't a huge thing, but you know, that's 40 years on. I'm feeling, actually, what can I now do for my children to, I don't know, immunize them perhaps from all the sort of negative and lost history? So yes, that's my
Thanks, Gloria. That's a great question. I'll take Derek first, and then we'll have answers to all of that. So yeah, Derek, are you there?
Hello.
Yeah, can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I kind of just wanted to ask sort of two questions. So the first one is, within movements like things like Black Lives Matter, for instance, how do we kind of make sure that we're centering the voices of people who are already marginalized within the Black community? So people like queer Black people, trans Black people, the voices that we tend not to necessarily hear on the whole anyways within sort of the world, and then also within the Black community and within these sorts of movements where trans Black people and queer Black people are sort of being harmed as well, and actually are those that we need to sort of think about within these movements too. The second question that I wanted to ask was kind of like, essentially, what is the role of allies within these conversations, I guess, as in like, how do allies effectively use their voice in order to make sure that they're being effective with causing change, rather than speaking over the voices of Black people who are doing a lot of work in order to kind of enact that change? But that just kind of comes from like a Twitter thread I saw the other day, which was where a non-Black person of color basically essentially said that Black people aren't doing enough, which is kind of a kind of conversation in and of itself, as in like, why are you basically, yeah, what is the role of allies within this in order to effectively aid the voices of Black people within these movements?
Yeah, great. Those are two great questions. So yeah, feel free to jump in.
These are all the questions. They're wonderful. Yeah, Derek, I just want to say, first of all, I loved your artwork. That's great. And I made a little note to find it myself to put on my walls. About supplemental education, I think that's a great idea. And I think there's a long history of that. You know, perhaps most, famously, the Black Panther Party had their freedom schools. And I think that's great. And I think anything that helps children feel at home in their own skin is always a beautiful and powerful thing. And it doesn't just, I don't know how old your children are, but it doesn't just have to be that, right? It can be great Black film, great Black books, Black role models. I know people who are very intentional about making sure they have Black dentists and Black physicians, and, just really cultivating the people in your child's life to reaffirm them and see all of the various expressions of Blackness in our world. And I think that's great. And it's something that weighs heavily on my mind as well, as how to both allow for childhood, right? And that we're not always constantly teaching our Black children that they need to be afraid and that people are out to get them and they have to always mind their P's and Q's, but knowing that that's a reality as well. So I'm with you on that one. And I will let other people speak on these other 2 points, but just one thing that I always think about when I hear the term allies is, someone said, this was part of the indigenous rights movement in the US, said, we don't need allies, we need co-conspirators. And so this idea that if you're an ally, you can dip your toes in and out as it benefits you. And when things get too hot or things get too dangerous, you can just fall back on your privilege, whatever that privilege might be, right? If it's white privilege, if it's gender privilege, if it's, in the case of America, being documented or undocumented, right? Having citizenship or not. Because I'm a citizen, I can do certain things that people who are not documented can't do. So thinking really about what it means to actually put your safety, either physical or just, you know, kind of ephemeral. Is it your job on the line? Is it you're going to lose a friend or a family member because you have your views? That's what is being an ally in a certain sense, is being willing to assume the risk that people of color are also taking in these struggles. That's all I have, so I'll let the rest of y'all speak.
I'll just pick up on that. So yesterday, Twitter reminded me that it was the birthday of Peter Norman. I don't know how many of you know who Peter Norman is, but Peter Norman is the white man in the photo of John Carlos and Tommy Smith on the Olympic podium doing the Black Power salute. And Peter Norman was an Australian track and field athlete, which is why he was on the podium. Very good athlete. And the story is that basically there was only one pair of gloves. He is the person who suggested that they wear one glove on one hand. That basically they split the gloves between the two of them. He sourced a badge, like a human rights badge that he wore. And the thing that's really for me powerful about the story is that Peter Norman then suffered enormous consequences for the rest of his life for standing by these two men. He was not allowed to compete in subsequent Olympics, despite being qualified to do so. When the Sydney Olympics happened in 2000, he was sort of held back from all of those events, despite still holding the Australian record in that event. And there's a photo of his funeral that makes me tear up every time I see it, because Tommy Smith and John Carlos are at the front of his casket, carrying his casket as his pallbearers. And for me, I think when we talk about allyship, I think first of all there's this idea that allyship is something that only the Black community, in this case, only the Black community can confer upon. And so the fact that they were at the head of his casket tells me all I need to know about whether his support was meaningful or not. But I think it's also the case that allyship does cost. And I think we're at a moment where, I don't know about y'all's social media feeds, but you know, I grew up in a pretty conservative area in the United States, and I am seeing a lot of people who I am pretty sure voted for Trump or hold other various forms of conservative views, who are now talking about defunding the police, and who are now sort of fluent in the language of, say, BIPOC and other terminology. And I am on the one hand very glad that we're here, and on the other hand, I'm kind of like, so there's probably going to come some point at which y'all aren't coming with us. And so one thing that I would say about the role of allies is that, first of all, it will probably cost something, and allies need to be aware. This is not just a fun time. This is not just a fun ride. We're in a moment now where people get a lot of validation by posting things on social media. And it's not always going to be that fun. And I think the other thing that I think about is just how much so many of these people are going to have to learn, because they're just not up to speed in these conversations. We've been having these conversations for years in the Black community. Those of us who are Black are having to have these conversations. We've had these conversations with our parents about how to behave and how to handle ourselves. Those of us who, I didn't go to sort of a formal sort of secondary or supplementary school, but my mother, I call it the G. Fryar School. My mother was very intent on my learning quite a bit about what it meant to be Black. And so that's a lot of time that these people for whom this is now fashionable, and hopefully they stay with us. It's not that I wish to be pessimistic about it, but 2 or 3 weeks of knowledge is not equivalent to a lifetime of knowledge. It's not equivalent to people who have been doing real activism for 5, 10, 15, 20 years and much longer. So I think there's going to need to be a humility among allies. I think they need to not rush to want to call themselves allies. That's not really what it's about. It's not about whether they are seen as allies. It's about the work that they're doing. Are they talking over people, or are they clearing paths for us? I think these are the real questions. And to Gloria, I mean, I fully agree with the need for various forms of supplementary education, whether they are formalized, whether they're and by formalized I mean we're formalized in the community, or whether they're a little bit more ad hoc. I mean, one of the things as an American I have realized is even just these tiny moments where the curriculum validated my existence as a Black person. And they weren't enormous. The Virginia, as I just said a few minutes ago, the Virginia curriculum involved validating Robert E. Lee, so it wasn't great. But there were these little moments where, say, for example, I could do like reports on Jackie Robinson, or I was learning about Mary McLeod Bethune, a Black educator. That looking back now as an adult, just it has become so clear how important and how formative that was for me as a Black person, to know that there were people who who weren't just enslaved, and I certainly take a lot of inspiration from my enslaved ancestors. So that's not the point that I'm making there. But to know that there were people who have lived great lives, and that was not closed down to me, that education wasn't closed down to me because I was a Black person, that political aspirations weren't closed down to me. And they are certainly harder, but having those models to look to as a child, I now realize were just so important. So I'll leave it there.
I also want to, can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Following on what both Christienna and Ashley said about supplementary school, I think, yeah, they're super important. And I think having, especially in your own family, because you can train teachers. I think this is a problem where I feel like a lot of people are facing, where teachers might not necessarily know how to educate kids on Black history because they're scared they're going to get it wrong. They're learning this for the first time. So I think that supplementary schools are good, as well as making sure that teachers understand their position in telling Black history. Because I didn't have supplementary school, but I was forced, and I say forced because at the time I was not happy about it. But now I'm really happy that I had to learn Yoruba when I was a kid. And I was consistently taken to Nigeria, consistently had to do extra work at home. And it gives me a sense of like, oh, this is who I am now, rather than being like, oh, I feel a little lost, I'm sad, I don't understand this. And makes me feel like more whole, and it's something that you can hold on to when you might feel like, oh, I don't know where I am. Especially I've had experience at uni where you're the only white person in the room countless times, or you're the only Black person in the room. I've never been a white person in the room. So I think it's also really important. In terms of the question about centering queer Black people and trans Black people, I think it's really difficult to answer. I think that personally, I don't have a foolproof answer. This is definitely going to solve this problem, because homophobia in general is just very difficult to solve. But I think that the problem, I think also, okay, firstly, I think this is a conversation that needs to be had within the Black community. So I'm not like a massive fan of saying stuff in like big spaces, which I guess this is one of them, to include people who are Black, because I think we then, and sometimes this happens of people, we then have people like pointing out, this is something that is really Black, like this is something that is white. Being gay is a white thing, it's not a Black thing. But actually it needs to be something that like is in, I'm not making sense. There's something that needs to be like an internal conversation. But on that, I also think that the fact that it's seen as something that is white is what exacerbates it. So instead of acknowledging that, actually, like if we go back and we look at history, like Black people who are trans and gay have been here literally forever, and have always been here. We need to do some work around trying to unlearn it as being something that doesn't belong to Black people. Black people are like this thing, so if there's something wrong, because that's not the case. Like, we're right here, we've been here the whole time. Personally, in my own life, I try to have this conversation with people every time it comes up to just keep defending people, but that was probably also because I'm queer myself, so I'm going to keep screaming about it. But I think it's difficult, and it's not something that's going to go away overnight, but it takes a lot of work. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Florence. I've got a couple more people wanting to speak, but if you do have more questions and contributions, do keep them coming either on Zoom or on YouTube. So I've got Dave Hitchcock and then Emanuela. So Dave.
Thanks. It's, I mean, my question was actually about the curriculum, believe it or not. So kind of talk about a perfect segue. It strikes me that the three panelists with us are all educators. And I was just wondering, when you are when you're in the classrooms, or when you are having these conversations, when you are trying to educate people, what do you pivot to sort of personally, I don't know, decolonize the curriculum is a good shorthand, but to sort of personally put Black lives back into the historical narrative, and sort of following on from that, in your view, are there ways to scale that? So I've been thinking a lot recently about the history wars, about Gary Nash in the 1990s, and this big throwdown that was had in the States over the structure and nature of primary and secondary school curriculum in the States. And in this country, it went largely without comment, but there was a kind of moment in the early 2010s where Michael Gove got to be in charge of the curriculum and basically just like took a hatchet to what was taught in this country. And I was just wondering, in your view, if there are some ways we can sort of, how do we undo that damage? What do we do to kind of get Black Lives Mattering in a very basic, everyday way back into the classroom for as many students as possible?
Great, thanks, Dave. We'll take Emanuela as well.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep, go ahead.
So much. This has been so interesting. My question is kind of ties into what we've been talking about with the sort of symbolism and materialism, and it kind of goes into the sort of sometimes over intellectualization and theorization, especially by white people. So I've seen quite a lot on Twitter, some people wanting to have conversations about kind of material, practical concerns for trying to improve things, and then white people trying to sort of one-upmanship or one-up-personship, trying to kind of out-theory each other or try and sort of out-woke each other. And then the actual questions sometimes get silenced or ignored. And I just, I wondered if there's a sort of maybe more practical way to avoid that sort of over. I mean, obviously theory is very important and intellectual conversations are important, but kind of coming back to what we were saying about sometimes losing sight of more material concerns, particularly in the kind of academic sphere. How do we counter that kind of, I don't know if it's like performative allyship or one-upmanship. Thanks.
Right, thanks, Emanuela. Yeah, anyone want to jump in on either of those? Both great questions again.
I guess I can jump in. Curiously, I think both of those questions have the same answer. It's for whom is this about, right? And so if we think about these kind of distracting, sidetracked conversations, I loved your phrase, how to outwoke somebody. For whom is that performance for? For whom does that discussion benefit? That's solely about the people having that discussion. It doesn't move the movement farther. And similarly, David, your question, I mean, I'm fortunate in the sense that I teach Black history, right, at the college level. So it's hyper-focused on Black people and their experiences. But part of my politics is always to assign Black scholars, right? Or to at least have the majority of those things to be by Black scholars. And when I do assign white scholars or other people, who are non-Black, I look at the politics and I think about what they're trying to do with their work, right? The for whom. So in terms of like the African-American canon, there's a really famous guy by the name of Dunning, and the Dunning School of History, which was basically like the Reconstruction era was horrible. Black people were really happy as slaves, and those Northerners came down south and messed it all up. So sometimes I assign Dunning, but for whom, right? And so it helps students begin to think critically about why Dunning wrote what he wrote, right? And so thinking about what is the impact. And I also like to really assign things to help my students decenter their own prejudice, their own frames, their own way of coming at this. And, you know, this was a function of having to teach online on account of COVID this year. But the last kind of assignment, instead of having this big sit down formal exam as I normally would, the final exam question this year was, what 5 events that you've learned over the course of the semester would you wish to have in your course, in your high school history courses, and why? And so really asking them to interrogate what they thought they knew but didn't know, and how does this new knowledge, right, centering the Black experience, shape how they now understand their own history. So those are just kind of 2 thoughts about both of those questions for me.
Thanks, Ashley. Florence or Christienna, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing I would say is that I am incredibly skeptical about the way that the language of decolonizing the curriculum is getting taken up at UK universities. Because it's sort of now becoming institutionalized in this way. So everybody is saying that they're decolonizing the curriculum, and that can sit alongside actually doing fairly little. It can sit alongside, you know, treating Black staff in horrible ways. It can sit alongside very sort of an entrenched set of often quite conservative politics within institutions. So I'm very skeptical about how that has moved from a radical call from, in particular, student activists to now a sort of institutional buzzword. And I think what happens in that process is actually it strips out the radical nature of it and just has it become this exercise in which presumably you put a few texts. It's never clear to me whether these texts are supposed to be by Black authors or just about Black people, but you put a few texts in the further reading section, call it a day, and apparently we've decolonized curricula. In my own teaching, like Ashley, I have the benefit of doing a lot of teaching that is sort of very specifically about Black history, whether that be the Caribbean courses that I teach, or now that I'm teaching Black British history at Goldsmiths. But interestingly, so I am trained as a historian of Britain, which at a number of institutions has been quite hard for people to understand. And at my previous institution, whose name I will not utter here, but a lot of us know which institution that is, I actually never taught on, I was never allowed to teach on the Modern Britain survey. Despite asking a number of times. To be fair, I was only at that institution for 2 years, but you know, there were a few lectures in that survey that in the department I was the expert on, because that was what I was trained in my PhD program as a historian of the British Empire in particular, that I was never on. And I made a request to be on that module in particular, with the point that we need to make clear that British history is not just about white people, for white people, and taught by white people. That this is a history that includes a much wider range of people and practitioners. And instead I was on the Global History Survey, which, you know, it had its logic. I'm not saying it didn't have any logic, but it was a situation where basically at least in some ways, what students might see is actually all of the people of color, both in terms of teaching and in terms of subject matter, are off in this area here called global history. And then European history basically remains this area of this untouched area of sort of white people's concerns. And, you know, I had very good colleagues at that institution who were similarly concerned about the setup there. So I don't want to suggest that everybody at that institution was fine with how all of that went down. Many of my former colleagues were not. But nonetheless, I think that this is the kind of thing that we're starting to see at a lot of institutions, where decolonizing ends up being, if it's more than a few books here and there, it ends up being, well, here's a new module of like global people of color, and then nothing else in the curriculum changes. And I think that this really has to be something that we're doing across the curriculum. It cannot be the sort of labor of, you know, a small group of people who tend to be people of color and or younger scholars. So I know at a lot of institutions, there are younger white scholars who are very invested in this, but they're junior. They don't necessarily have the institutional heft to sort of force other people to make adjustments. And so the work is all being done by this small group of people in this small area of courses, and then the rest of the curriculum remains unchanged. But in terms of my own teaching, like Ashley, I make a big point of putting as many Black scholars or Latinx scholars as I can in my courses. I also, particularly with Black British history, talk quite a lot about why there aren't, or quite explicitly with my students, about why there are so many African American scholars who are represented in our reading list as opposed to Black British scholars. I talk a lot about sort of where, you know, which countries are more comfortable with this kind of work, and which countries have yet to create much space for it. And I think one of the things that we can do, aside from just what we're assigning, is to talk very explicitly about why things are the way they are in the academy. Hiding that from our students, I think, does no service. It just sort of makes it seem like it's the natural order of things, as opposed to a situation that has been manufactured by centuries of white supremacy.
Thanks, Christianna. I've got oh, Florence, were you going to come in? Sorry, I cut you off again.
Just touching on what you were saying about certain like modules being separate, I think this is also like negative for the students at unis. In my own experience, I felt like a lot of time you'll have students who are, you have white students who will take a module about places in Africa or the Caribbean, and then like find and it like bolsters this idea of what we were talking about before about the allies feeling like they've done all that, and they've been amazing because they use the time that they had of their $9 grand spending it learning about this and therefore know everything, but not understanding that those two things, that because it's separate, because you separate it, doesn't seem like it's part of a whole history, but something that's separate and niche that they can like talk to people about and write people about. Yeah, but in terms of as an educator, all my teaching is to do with original research on Black people. So all of it is written by Black people. All of our team are Black, which is great. Yeah.
Brilliant, thanks, Florence. So I've got a few questions to read out. We've still got time if you want to add your name to the list as well. So I'll read from Maya. She writes, how can we put archives to work using them as part of our anti-racist work? And then Lamisha asks, is there too much pressure on young Black people on social media to educate others? She's received messages from white peers but regards herself as no expert. So does anyone want to come in on either of those?
Can I talk about, just to address the second question, I think there is a lot of pressure. A young person who's not got Black history of Black people on social media, I think that there is a lot of pressure on people not understanding that we're people as well, and that we have, I would say this, but we consistently have stuff going on in the same way that everybody has stuff going on, and we can't be expected to be like the be-all and know-all of Black history and how to solve every problem, because we're not. I've literally just finished uni. I'm still trying to figure how to pay taxes, let alone how to solve racial discrimination threats. Like it's, I think that people need to understand that you can do stuff yourself. Like if people want to know what color the sky is, they can Google it and how it's blue. You can do that in the same way. This is how I try to explain to you, because I find it incredibly exhausting to have to keep like regurgitating stuff that is a lot of times incredibly traumatic to have to keep explaining. Like the racism in your face as well. It's like, oh yes, it's happened to me as well. This is really terrible. I have to keep telling you. So I think there's a lot of pressure on young people. I think that people need to take some way to understand that like there are some things that you can learn by yourself. In the same way that I think this goes for. I think it goes for when people also, especially, and I don't want to take the conversation away, but sometimes we have people in the queer community who are like, oh my god, like, how can we help trans people? And like consistently, like, and like expecting trans people to constantly be there and like regurgitate their trauma for you. And it's like, especially Black trans people, and actually, no, like there are so many resources people have unlocked their trauma for, and has like it. To write a book about something is not easy. To write a book about something that you find traumatic is, I can't imagine. I don't know. But I think that people need to understand like there are these, and that you can focus on these. And those are actually quite honest and truth telling, rather than expecting your friend to, just by replying to their story, for them to tell you everything that's happened since 1800 something, because that's not possible.
Did anyone want to come in on the point about archives and how we might, I suppose I'm not sure if the question is about our historical work or our activist work, but I suppose how we can put archives to use in a way that's in the spirit of History Acts, I suppose, making history useful for our organising the present. Does anyone have any ideas on that?
I don't know if I have an idea specifically, but I did just want to note something of a convergence. We've talked a little bit about the pandemic and the way that it's sort of, at least for non-Black people, they're sort of forced into focusing on this conversation. But the other sort of consequence of the pandemic is that we're now having all these conversations about Black history at a time that the archives are closed. And in particular, a lot of archives that are specific to Black history are closed and are not digitized. So my students in the module I was teaching this year were supposed to go to various London archives to do their papers, and we actually I actually had to change the assessment because the archives weren't open, and there are so many fewer digitized resources for them. And I think that this is one concern that I have, and to some degree it's a specialist concern, but I do worry that certain forms of history are still relatively accessible via digitized platforms, and then just at this moment that we really need to be thinking about what the archives can show in the way that this question is asked. So many of the archives for Black British people are not as well digitized, not as well available at this particularly critical moment, which seems to me not inevitable, but an unfortunate consequence, but one that has a politics that we need to think about.
Cool. I've got a question from Benjamin, who's unfortunately had to leave. But he says, inspired by the current discussion, I wonder if anyone might have any positive thoughts on combating the potential negative impacts in terms of the mass letting go of casualised staff, streamlining modules, etc. That's in brackets, of the pandemic on our capacity to do and teach anti-racist histories in universities specifically. He says that he works at Queen Mary on a casualised contract, and the module on race and the desire for difference is being suspended and, quote, folded in to other modules as a result of the sort of austerity measures of the pandemic. So yeah, that's a really great question. And if anyone wants to jump in on that, he also wanted me to link to this tweet, which is one of his colleagues been trying to make a bit of noise about that at Mary. So yeah, does anyone want to come in on that and how these economic impacts of the crisis might affect anti-racist work in universities? I mean, it's a hard question.
I mean, I feel like I'm doing a lot of talking. This is really concerning. And I have seen I am familiar with the situation at Queen Mary from that set of tweets, which I think came out a few days ago. So I would strongly recommend that people go look at the situation there. But in Britain, at least, one of the situations that we have in terms of particularly Black British history is that, with the exception of Hakeem Adi at Chichester, who works with the Young Historians Project, and Olivet Otele at Bristol, there are not any senior Black scholars in history departments in the country. So there are a lot of people who are or not a lot of people. There are more people who are lecturers. There are even more people who are in various casualized positions. And then I would say even once we step beyond Black scholars, even people who just have expertise in this field tend to be more junior, and they tend to be casualized. So at this moment, where institutions are now quote unquote streamlining, and that might be in terms of streamlining modules or whatever neoliberal terms are being used to justify the costing casualized people their jobs. We're also losing a lot of really critical expertise in a lot of these areas, whereas the sort of traditional areas of academia or of academic history are going to continue sailing ahead because that's where a lot of the senior people are. These other fields are going to be quite significantly diminished. On the one hand, this moment should be one in which institutions should be thinking a little bit more carefully about who they're letting go and which areas of expertise they're letting go. But on the other hand, the significant mismanagement of UK universities, which has led us into a series of strikes, a number of strikes over the past few years, means that I am concerned, greatly concerned about our ability to do that as a sector.
Ashley or Florence, did you want to come in on that point?
I can't speak to the UK system, but we're witnessing something similar in the US, which is that many people who do either studies of people of color or gender history often have 50-50 appointments or split appointments, which means you have two administrative homes, which means you have two sets of meetings, two sets of service requirements. And then in a moment such as we're living in, when this becomes, chic, shall we say, racial justice becomes chic, those people who are already stretched because of this and have a great deal of invisible labor because students are coming to us because they want somebody who looks like them or who understands their experience, or we just seem more accessible, are then also being asked to spearhead anti-racist initiatives or to speak about what it means to be a person of color on the faculty or to draft letters. And so that's a way that we see this. And of course, we know, again, in the US system, at the end of the day, the only thing that gets you tenure is your formal publication records. Speaking to community groups, having an open door, my door is here, having an open door where students feel safe to talk to you, but they're not your advisees, they're not registered for your classes. That is all things that take up a great deal of your time that could be spent on writing and publishing, but doesn't matter in the long run. But they want to keep us here because they want to keep students of color at universities, at American universities, well, because it looks good on brochures and helps add, it's a value added. There was a very sad article in the New York Times several years back that says like elite institutions want to balance how many students of color that they have. They want enough to like create an experience. And the person who wrote the article likened it to a club. Like you want to have enough good looking people in a club to invite people there, but not too many to like freak people out. And that's a numbers game that a lot of American universities are playing to figure out how to deal with these concerns for people of color.
Cool, thanks. Related to that point, actually, a question via YouTube from BA, who says, what can we do to attract more BIPOC, not just students, but staff? And they add that it's disingenuous to talk about decolonizing the curriculum when history departments have all white staff. So you can think about that. And I'll also take a question now from Farida.
Hi. My question actually fits quite well, I think, with the question you just read out. I was going to ask, as someone who has both a sort of a faculty position and therefore a lot of contact with faculty, but also is in a lot of contact with students, especially kind of students of colour through various working groups and whatnot. A thing that I sort of hear from both sides is almost, you know, if we want to change reading this and we want to change the content of our history curriculum, then the students should sort of tell us what they want to study, and they should sort of suggest what it is that they want. I've even had sort of students tell me that when they went to a tutor about how their reading list wasn't diverse enough, the tutor was like, well, why don't you make your own reading list, as it were. And the students that I encounter, they are often much more clued up on the latest scholarship and the latest on the kind of the scholarship, the debates and the issues than many of the people who are, you know, in positions of power and who are faculty and who have paid up jobs and permanent jobs. And I find it really, I suppose the question that I want to ask is about the sort of ethics, I guess, of placing the burden on the students who are paying the fees to come and be educated to now take charge. I mean, forget the fact that they're spending, you know, they end up spending 3 years having to be in this like activist mode, right? Pressing for change. But even this kind of the simple request of like, tell us what you want to study, it feels to me that that's somehow a sort of a dereliction of the duty that we have as kind of pedagogues or teachers, that it's a sort of shifting the burden of education. And I'm completely into the idea of kind of flipping the classroom and making learning much less hierarchical, but I also feel like there's something wrong when the people who have power and who are being paid to teach history need to turn to the students to be educated better. And I just wondered what the kind of panelists who have all been amazing think about the role of undergraduates, particularly in history degrees.
Yeah, there's two great questions again, and definitely, as you say, related. So if anyone wants to come back in on them.
So can I? Yeah. Okay. I think that what you're, in terms of what Frida was saying is very true about shifting education towards making the students like I don't know, I feel like I experienced it more so when I was doing my A-levels at university, where like there were occasions where when I was in history classes where me and like the 3 other Black people were forced to explain intersectionality to the rest of the class, when we're supposed to be students and we're supposed to be also in class for exams. I think that I currently, I think it must, because at my university they had roles for students to come in. So undergraduates, if you wanted to come in, I think it was towards the end of your time, if you wanted to come in to be part of like an inquest into how to decolonize the curriculum, which I think useful in terms of like students feeling that they can be included. But also, I think it was important that it's paid. And I know that this, I know some people might think, oh, but like it's important, but I just, yeah, I think you should pay people if you're going to do things like that. Because as much as they're students, it's like, yes, they're part of the university, I do think it's like vital that if you're going to get someone to do extra work, apart from what they're already doing, they should definitely be compensated, and therefore like people should be taught that like your knowledge and your experience is valuable, not just something that is like, oh, we need it for this little thing, and like it'll be part of your degree, and it'll be like nice exposure, and you can learn some things. But actually, we need your voice, and it's important. So I don't know. Because then also, I think they also get a choice and see it more like I'm giving you something, and I'm might be making it more helpful for like the people who are being undergraduates after me, more so than being forced to do something, being forced to make their own reading list, which I can't imagine what that would be like. Yeah, no, yeah. So pay kids, pay students.
Yeah, I think this is something that troubles me incredibly, the idea that we as educators abandon our task to be up on our fields of expertise, which includes being up on the breadth of our fields of expertise. You know, I certainly can't speak for every field of history out there, but certainly the ones that I work in have decades of scholarship that people can be reading and can be drawing on, and it is our business as educators to do so. I think it's certainly fine to make sure that we are, you know, listening to what students say they want, but and I agree with Florence that they should be paid to do so. This is not free labor. But the idea that it is a student's job to come up with a reading list, to determine the state of the curriculum, that we just sit back and have the students do all the work for us when we are the ones with PhDs and who are the scholars who are paid to do this work. I mean, I think that's a pretty hostile environment for students. If I, as a student, had felt that the only way to develop as a scholar was to teach my professors, like that's not that's not a teaching relationship. And I do think, I mean, I am sort of horrified to hear this from Farida, but I'm also not that surprised, because I think what we hear in a lot of these conversations, internal conversations about decolonizing the curriculum, is a lot of people saying that they don't know what to do, they can't figure this out, they don't have the time. None of us have the time. And as Ashley has pointed out, none of us have the time, and scholars of color are doing a lot of extra work in either because they're in joint appointments, or because we are doing more mentoring, or because we are concerned about our students, say during a pandemic. That there are all kinds of extra things that we're having to do. But our basic job is to train undergraduates in our fields as they are fully represented, and also to make those histories as relevant and as useful for undergrads as possible. So I'm very troubled by this turn. I don't quite know how we solve it, because I think there are a lot of people who just are never going to do this work, and they might not say it as bluntly as that, but they're just not going to do this work. But on the other hand, we cannot then turn that over to students to basically teach themselves, because if they're teaching themselves, why do they need us? Then we should just say that they don't need to come, because we're not teaching them anything.
Thanks, Christianna. I've got no questions lined up, so I think in a minute I'll just go back to the panel finally for some final thoughts on the conversation and any sort of closing remarks they want to give. Before I do that, I want to thank all of the panelists so much for coming, and Jabu, who was here earlier, and thanks to everyone for their great questions. And it's been fantastic to have so many people here, not just on Zoom, but streaming as well. Just to say, we will be doing more of these History Acts remotely, so do keep an eye on the website and the Twitter, and you can also go on the website and on our YouTube channel to see the archive we've been building up of the ones that we've been doing so far online. So yeah, I think that's it from me. So I'll go back to the panel. I think we'll do it in reverse order. So if we go Ashley, then Christienna, then Florence. So Ashley.
It dawned on me that I was the last speaker, so that meant I was first. Well, first of all, I think this is such a wonderful opportunity, and I thank you for the invitation. I thank you for being allowed to be privy of this conversation. And frankly, these need to be the conversations that are constantly happening between scholars and activists, activists and scholars, because we inform our work so well. And it means a lot to me to begin to think about this and as it's unfolding, as opposed to 50 years later. So this is a real treat. One just kind of thought about kind of tying all of these last threads together. Someone asked about the question of using archives for anti-racism. I think some of the most interesting cutting edge scholarship is coming out of Black feminists, scholars who are thinking about this. So I'm thinking about Jennifer Nash's new book about Black feminism reimagined, and thinking about the ways in which Black feminism and intersectionality has been co-opted by institutions and how Black feminist scholars need to surrender it. So I think that's useful to talk and to think about this. I also think scholars like Sadia Hartman and Marissa Fuentes have really creative ways of putting agency, Black women's agency, in archives that have traditionally done violence, both literal and figurative, to Black women. Marissa Fuentes' book is Dispossessed Lives. Sadia Hartman's most recent book is Beautiful Lives, Wayward Women, or something like that. I think those are really excellent books to begin to, as Fuentes calls it, read against the biased grain of how we do history and how we think about it. And the final note to kind of tie this again is institutions replicate themselves, right? They hire people who look and think like them, they promote classes, they encourage students. And so by broadening our knowledge, by expanding, by taking chances on young, creative, cutting edge scholars and supporting them through the entirety of their career, we can begin to dismantle some of these structural issues that we're seeing in the academy and frankly in education, from the most primary levels all the way to graduate levels. Again, thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this conversation.
Thanks, Ashley. Christienna.
So I would also like to sort of echo my thanks for being here, and especially because, as Stefan knows, I was supposed to be on one of these panels quite some time ago. I think it was almost 3 years ago now, and I got quite dehydrated at the conference, and so was too ill to participate. So I'm very thankful for the second invitation, and also have to say it's an honor to be on a panel with Florence. Who, yes, was a student of mine at Liverpool. I think, just briefly, what I would say is I think we are at a really interesting and exciting moment. And part of the sign that it is an exciting moment is that I am an inveterate pessimist. I'm probably the most pessimistic person all of my friends know. And even I see this as a moment of really enormous possibilities. I think it's sort of unimaginable, or it would have been unimaginable even a month or two ago to imagine the sort of conversations we're having now about defunding the police, about not just vaguely about pulling statues down, but about the aftermath of pulling statues down. To see, city councils say these statues don't have to go back up, which certainly in the US context, what happens after a statue doesn't always stay down. So it is a moment of really immense possibility that has been made possible by people in the streets. And people in the streets, we have to say, people in the streets at grave risk to themselves, both in terms of grave risk to their immediate physical health in terms of police brutality, which we were certainly seeing in significant quantities in the U.S., but that we were also seeing a few weeks ago in Britain, in particular with the London protest, where there was police on horse, and then in particular one horse got out of control, and that's of course an incredibly dangerous situation and a dangerous police tactic. But also part of what is inspiring me about these movements is just how many people are out in the street at a moment when we are not supposed to be gathering in large numbers together because of the pandemic. And it is both a testament, I think, to just how serious this crisis is for Black people, that we have to risk being out in the streets in a pandemic, but also I think a sign of enormous hope that we are doing that, but also that there are so many people who are at the moment joining us, and also in the middle of a pandemic. So I think there's a lot of hope in this moment. I really liked what Ashley said earlier about this being an entirely new kind of movement. I think it's going to be very interesting to see where we go from this. But I think it is also, as a historian, I also have to keep in mind that this is going to be a long haul. I think there's going to be a lot of vigilance that we need to maintain. So these city councils that are saying, let's defund the police, what does that actually mean? What are, in a year, have they done that? Have they made any moves forward? If we lose the Colston statue in Bristol, but everything else stays up, or we make no headway on the issues about the BAME community's higher risk for COVID-19, or we still don't have people caught up in the Windrush scandal properly compensated, or we still have, or heaven forbid, we still have people being deported back to the Caribbean. I think we have to stay vigilant to make sure that the concessions that are getting made now in this moment of crisis, that we don't sort of lose them as we all sort of gradually get back to work and get back to sort of the busyness of our lives, and we don't lose focus on where those initiatives have actually gone. Have they gone where we intended them to go? Are there ways to keep putting pressure on, and keeping in mind that this is a longer struggle and not something that this moment is very powerful, but it's not just about this particular moment.
Great, thanks. And finally, Florence.
Hello. So I'd like to thank you for letting me be on this panel, because I wasn't doing anything today, but I would have jumped and moved everything out of my schedule, and to be with both Ashley, Christienna, and Mavu, who was here, but I don't know, but yes, she had to go. I just want to quickly touch on, I think I said something before, but I actually think it's very important. I should definitely say that I think radical unity is definitely something that we need to make sure we have in terms of keeping this, as we've said, like it needs to be consistent in order for it to just get past, like when everyone goes back to their lives, because for some people this is their life, and especially again talking about, to properly address the question that Derek said earlier about centering queer lives in this movement, which is also, I think, the organizations need to like team up with queer organizations, because queer organizations do exist. By actually teaming up, you actually create the precedence of like, yes, we're all one and the same, we can all work on this together, rather than it being like separate and seeing that well, we're having to fight for this by ourselves and you guys are doing this by yourselves. So I think that's something to focus on, but especially consistency with education, and yeah, with education, especially what I'm doing at the Young Historians Project. I will keep raving about it because I think it's great. In terms of like making sure we're teaching and researching history that people don't know about, and isn't shouted about as much as it should be, especially now that we're currently talking about COVID and we're talking about everyone who's been working in hospitals, who's been working in health and is been unfairly treated. Like, that is literally the research that we've been focusing on. So I think that's also really important. Yeah, I'd also like to just a quick plug that, in terms of that, the Black Queer Student Fund, which I think Derek, his name is actually Gavin, his name is Derek. It's just the wrong name on the Zoom, but he is Black Queer Student Fund, which is something that has come out, which he's been doing before the pandemic and is currently raising funds for now. If I can find a link, I will send it. Yeah, there's also some important ways that you can support. Yeah.
Great, thanks for that. And yeah, we'll definitely put a link to that on our Twitter and our website. So thanks again to everyone who came and to all our panel, and we'll leave it there. Thanks a lot. Good night.